She was merely a girl, no more than 10 years of age, when the Pontifex Maximus singled her out from the crowd and proclaimed her the next Vestal Virgin. From that very instant, her existence was no longer hers to command. Selected not for influence, riches, or personal ambition, but for her sanctity and destiny, she entered a position that would forge a connection to Rome deeper than any ruler or politician could ever hope to achieve. What drove the Romans to surrender their own daughters to a life of holy confinement? The process of choosing a Vestal Virgin, officially known as a Virgo Vestalis, was a grave and unsettling ritual. The chosen candidate had to be between 6 and 10 years old, with both parents still living, of Roman citizenship, and from a family free of any public shame. Beyond these requirements, she had to be physically perfect and the product of a legitimate marriage, serving as a living reflection of Rome's ideal purity. The child would stand in a group, and from that selection, the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, would choose her, either by lottery or by direct appointment. Being selected was not an honor all families welcomed. Many wept, not from pride but from sheer terror. Once chosen, the girl was silently led away. She walked the Sacra Via, the sacred path, for the final time as an ordinary child of Rome. Henceforth, she was pledged to the goddess Vesta, her body and spirit becoming the property of the state. The historian Plutarch, in his Life of Numa, recounts how King Numa Pompilius founded the Order of Vestal Virgins, charging them with the protection of the sacred flame and choosing them from Rome's most distinguished families. This was far more than a religious obligation. It was a state-level act, saturated with ceremony, devotion, and the crushing weight of Rome's moral code. The Vestals were housed in the House of the Vestals, or Atrium Vestae, located next to the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. There, under the vigilant watch of elder Vestals and priests, she was to dedicate the following 30 years to service: a decade for learning, a decade for practice, and a final decade for teaching. Her responsibilities were not solely spiritual. They were intensely political. The flame she was tasked to protect represented the eternal existence of Rome, and her vow of chastity was viewed as a direct measure of the state's ethical integrity. These young women were constrained not by physical chains, but by statutes more rigid than any dungeon wall. And after being chosen, there was no going back. Not to her family, not to her identity, and most agonizingly, not to the life she had previously known. To serve Vesta meant to be reborn, as a living monument, a symbol of Roman virtue. Yet, beneath this veneer of adoration was a more sinister reality. The city would idolize her, right up until she made one single error. But the most unyielding rule of all was the one that controlled her body. The oath of chastity, sworn before the goddess Vesta herself, was absolute. For 3 decades, a Vestal was prohibited from marrying, from initiating physical contact, or from being touched by any man. This was not simply a religious principle, it was a national security imperative. Her body was considered inviolable, and the purity it symbolized was not a private matter. It was a political one. Unyielding justice, Rome's fierce discipline. She was sacred, but she was never secure. The Vestal Virgin, dressed in her ceremonial white robes and celebrated by the Roman populace, existed not just under divine command but also under the constant pressure of Roman law, a law that was both unforgiving and final. Admired in public yet watched relentlessly in private, her holiness was maintained through methods more savage than sacred. What occurred when these most venerated women in Rome faltered? The Vestals were held to 3 primary laws: unwavering virginity, absolute obedience, and the diligent protection of the sacred fire. To breach any of these rules brought swift, and frequently ruthless, consequences. If the eternal flame within the Temple of Vesta was ever allowed to die out, it wasn't just a ceremonial misstep, it was a catastrophic omen for the Roman state. In these instances, the head Vestal in charge could face punishment in private, which sometimes included being whipped by the Pontifex Maximus. But this was always done out of the public eye. This was no symbolic penalty. It was a harsh, degrading rite, performed in total darkness, usually at night, to protect the holy woman from public view, even while she endured the pain. Historical accounts verify that when the sacred fire went out, Vestals were at times beaten with rods, always in the dark, and were never publicly disrobed, a chilling testament to the fine line between ritual honor and physical abuse. Beyond the physical discipline, the psychological seclusion was relentless and deliberate. For the entire 30-year term of her service, a Vestal had to maintain her celibacy. Her world strictly limited to the Atrium Vestae, an isolated compound in the Roman Forum. Her every interaction was meticulously observed. She was forbidden from even speaking casually with men. The faintest whisper of misconduct could launch a formal inquiry by the College of Pontiffs, and once accused, a Vestal was left with virtually no way to defend herself. In these matters, Roman justice seldom began with a presumption of innocence. To be a Vestal was not to be safe from suffering or dread. It was to inhabit a hallowed cage, honored on altars and punished in the shadows. The silent tomb, Rome's right of bloodless sentence. The Roman Republic was built on the pillars of law, morality, and control. But when the very symbol of that morality, a Vestal Virgin, was found to have broken her vow of chastity, Rome's justice became quiet, ceremonial, and completely unforgiving. It was a punishment so chilling in its methodical calmness that it took a life without spilling a single drop of blood. What transgression in Rome warranted being buried alive? The crime was incestum, a holy defilement, the tainting of Vesta's purity. If a Vestal Virgin was convicted of violating her oath of chastity, the sentence was not torture, nor death by the sword, but a ritual of live entombment. This practice, conceived to prevent the spilling of sacred blood, was a bloodless form of execution, and it was held in reserve solely for Rome's most esteemed women. The execution of Vestal Virgins in 216 BCE stands as one of the most documented and grim illustrations of Roman justice. As recorded by Livy, 2 Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were found guilty by the Pontifical College on the charge of incestum for breaking their sacred oaths. Their trial was held in private, and any arguments they might have made in their defense are lost to history. Once condemned, their destiny was sealed. One was entombed alive, while the other chose to end her own life. The rite started in silence. No shouts, no pleas. The convicted Vestal was escorted through the Roman Forum in a solemn march, draped in white, shoeless and veiled, resembling a bride on her way to be married. But this was not a wedding. It was her funeral. The procession came to a halt at the Campus Celeratus, the Wicked Field, located just beyond the Colline Gate. There, a small chamber had been prepared, excavated from the earth. Placed inside were a cot, a lamp, some bread, water, and milk, tokens of basic survival, enough to maintain the fiction that her death was not a state-ordered killing. The Romans maintained that she was not executed, but rather abandoned to the gods. After she walked down the steps, the entrance was covered over with dirt and rock. She would never be heard from again. The state refused to classify the burial as a homicide. By leaving provisions, Rome could argue that she was merely imprisoned underground. But there was no way out, no chance of rescue, no process for appeal. When her oxygen depleted, so did her life, and with it, any question that Rome was willing to formalize cruelty in the service of virtue. The ritual was intentionally devoid of any public display of death. That was the essence of it. Silence was a weapon as much as the tomb itself, designed to wipe the disgraced Vestal from the collective memory. Her identity, her honor, and her life were sealed beneath the ground. The destiny of Rome's Vestal Virgins exposes a society that would elevate innocence to a divine level while punishing imperfection with ruthless accuracy. Revered as godly symbols, yet condemned the moment they were accused, these women existed at the intersection of faith, law, and authority, buried not just by earth, but by the immense weight of an empire. In the face of such rites, we are forced to ask, what does a society forfeit when it trades humanity for the ideal of purity? As Thucydides once noted, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Let us consider this lesson carefully.